Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched, where this week I watched Shutter Island from 2010. Now, strictly speaking, this is not considered generally to be a horror movie. But for a couple of reasons, it is to me. The first and foremost is that I remember when this movie came out and the ads that ran on TV at the time. And the marketing around this movie was very aggressive. And it portrayed it very much as a kind of horror movie. It wasn't. You can probably go find some of the old ads that ran for this movie, but this was very much an era where there were a lot of movies, a lot of horror movies that were doing a lot of. This was like a ramping up of jump scares, a lot of lighting work and stuff like that was meant to just like surprise you with images, that sort of stuff. And a lot of the ads around those types of movies were cut in such a way that it was basically just like a slideshow of shocking images with really overly aggressive like pseudo musical backing. That is, to my memory, what a lot of the ads like this were like. And they used to run kind of late-ish at night, late enough that it was like, this is, target audience is for very much for adults. And they freaked me out. And it wasn't like the only movie that was being advertised with a darker tone or anything. My memory is that this was really aggressively marketed pretty much as a horror movie. Which is interesting because it doesn't itself want to be. Now, we could go on a whole side tangent about how the movie trailer companies are not the same as the production companies themselves. It's contracted out and how all that works. But I mean, if you know it, you know it. If you don't, it doesn't matter. So that doesn't entirely surprise me. I would also say now, after having watched this movie, that while I can understand why it would not strictly be considered a horror movie, I think it falls into the category, and I mean that in a positive way. You've heard me talk before about how a lot of horror movies really rely on cheap scares and that sort of thing to get their horror badge. And my feeling, as always, is that true horror, good horror movies rely on a buildup of tension that is never released. It's just sort of it's a growing sensation, so that you still have a sense of fear of some kind when you're done with the movie. There should be no conclusion. There's and the spikes and drops of the likes of a jump scare movie that's a whole other genre to my mind. And so the line then gets a little bit blurry between something like a horror movie and a thriller. And to me, that has more to do with the focus of the narrative, both internally, what the narrative is about, as well as the emotions that it primarily seems to want to invoke in the viewer. And this, to me, is structured and presented in such a way that it does not at least fit the traditional type of thriller structure and sort of pattern of tensions that I would expect from a thriller. So it does fall enough into the horror category to be horror to me. So yeah, that all to get around to me saying, this may or may not be the last one for so-called spooky season, since we're not quite at the end of October when this will air. Well, we'll see one way or another. I had sort of forgotten about this movie a bit, and that's despite the fact that it actually came very highly recommended to me by a friend pretty near the time that it came out. And my resistance to watching it was really because of that marketing. This is a friend who I've known for a very long time and who has a much higher tolerance for certain things, especially in the realm of horror than I do. So I was like, okay, well, I appreciate the I appreciate the recommendation, but I don't really think it's for me, and I never got around to it. But it's been sitting in my library forever, I've finally gotten around to it. I'm glad I did. I actually kind of forgot, again, as has been the case more and more recently, I forgot that this was directed by who this was directed by. It's directed by Martin Scorsese. And I would actually say that it doesn't have a lot of typical Scorsese hallmarks. I'll jump to the end and say I like this movie enough that I will probably end up watching it again at some point, and I will probably then have more of an eye out for Scorsese elements. But this does not stand out to me as a Scorsese movie compared to something like The Irishman, which we also watched on the show and I had a rather long video about. I think this is a much better movie probably than The Irishman, although I'll be honest, The Irishman is so unremarkable to me that I can barely remember it now, however many years on it is. I think it's like 2-3 years. And so remembering almost nothing from it, barely remembering who's in it, and barely remembering any scenes is not a great sign. Whereas this movie strikes me as something that will stick in my mind a lot more. It's a lot more memorable for a lot of reasons. Just on its face, I really appreciate what this movie does cinematography wise, and with its lighting and direction and all those sorts of things, the production that especially for the time would have been very against the grain, whether in the thriller genre or the horror genre. The idea of using very dull colors and poor lighting and that sort of thing to get a sort of mood applied to a scene was pretty normal. And this is a movie that is generally very well lit, and when it's not well lit, it is selectively lit. There's no murky scenes really of any kind in this movie where you can't tell what's going on. There's really not a lot of scenes either where things are washed out. There are a few moments, especially sort of in, well, let's just say in darker scenes in general. There are some appropriate lessenings of color, mostly just because of lighting context. But there is nothing where I said that looks like it was color graded down. If anything, I think there are a few scenes that might be a little bit oversaturated, and that makes a little bit more sense once you've seen the whole film. I'm not going to get into any of the details. I don't think it's like a spoiler or anything really. I think a lot of the reasons for that are kind of self-evident right off the bat. In fact, I'll just get into it, which is to say that this is a movie about an investigation on an island that houses I forget what the terminology they use for it. I think it's a hospital a facility for the criminally insane or something like that. Basically, it's a prison island that is also intended to be a rehabilitation center. And so with all the context around that being about sort of insanity and mental health and medications and all these other sort of thematic things, having a lot of elements in the production, whether it's the lighting or some of the other things that give you a sense of unreality, are kind of important towards getting you immersed in it. I think you could go for a very dark and dour kind of feeling instead if you wanted to, but it would really be a waste of opportunity. As pretty much every super desaturated movie is a waste of opportunity to use the media to its utmost extent. So having a lot of well-saturated colors and well-done lighting and all this both makes for a more visually appealing movie and one that tells a better narrative with the use of the tools at its disposal. The where do I want to go with this? We'll probably talk about the plot a little bit at the end because I don't want to spoil too much, and I won't be spoiling the whole thing, and I'll signpost that when we get to it. As far as the rest of the production goes, so the cinematography is very good. There's some shots I really like in this movie. Again, not ones that stick out to me as being particularly Scorsese, but just that are kind of smart, inventive, give a sense of perspective, and give a sense of whatever character's mental state at the time. It's really interesting to see some of the strange feeling shots that are butted up against each other, where there's a jarring difference in the lens that was used, or the focus that was used, or some other thing that is used to really good effect to sort of give a sense of disorientation, and there's lots of little things in the edit as well that lead to that as well, that lead to a feeling of sort of being unclear on what's going on, being in the middle of an investigation, and also being suspicious, paranoid, whatever else. And so that all leads, whenever the execution of a medium lends itself to the story that it's telling, that's obviously a great synergy to be shooting for all the time. Kind of what we always hope for, but is not that common, unfortunately. The cast is a little bit interesting. It's definitely a pretty substantial list of at least somewhat notable actors. Obviously, Leonardo DiCaprio being the leading man on this. This was sort of right at the end of when he passed for being youngish middle age. He's definitely full on middle age now. Like doesn't pass for a younger man anymore. That he had a baby face for kind of a long time. And so this was sort of as his career, I feel like, was taking a little bit of a downturn. He was no longer able to play that sort of very youngish, handsome leading man kind of role as much. I've talked about him before, I believe. I can't remember the context on this show, but he is again one of those folks who I don't think has a huge amount of range. He mostly plays variations on himself, but has enough range that, like, it's not a bad casting. It's just, it's just fine. I still see him as DiCaprio, unfortunately. But he has the energy, he has the range, he has the both vocal and physical acting chops to execute this role. And this is a fairly demanding role, I think, for his character to present a variety of different ways. Unfortunately, it's just, I've watched enough movies with him in it. I've seen every face that he can make. I'm sorry. That's just kind of how it is. I would prefer that Hollywood movies didn't cast the same actors all the time forever and ever, but that's how it is. And so when I've seen every face you can make and I've heard every voice you can do, it becomes glaringly obvious when, you're pressing basically up against the limits of your acting capabilities. So he's fine. Mark Ruffalo obviously is a much bigger name now than he was then. This was not an early role for him, I don't think, but probably one of his larger roles for the time. I'm not super knowledgeable on his whole background, but this would have been sort of a few years. When was the first Hulk movie that he was in? Like 2016, maybe. Oh God. Anyway, let's not digress too much there. His is an interesting case because I again think that he's another actor who more or less plays variations on himself. I think that's okay for this role, and I think there are some special conditions about his about his role that means that it's easy to misinterpret what he's doing in sometimes, and that goes for some of the other actors as well. There are a lot of strange acting decisions that happen in the movie that in retrospect make slightly more sense, or at least could be interpreted as being deliberate, because this movie is on a kind of core level, and again, I don't think this is really that much of a spoiler, about Leonardo DiCaprio's character being a fairly obvious unreliable narrator, or at least one who has ulterior motives or interpretations that he's not explaining. That much is clear from the very start of the movie. And so everybody around him ends up acting like a little bit strangely as a result. There's also some fairly big names, but in more limited roles. So Ben Kingsley and Max von Sydow are two guys with long cinematic histories behind them, but who are not like they're notable names, but not the biggest leading men by any means. And there's a lot of other ensemble cast members who I do think do really well. There is one other, I'm forgetting who it is. There's quite the cast list actually, and I'm not going to go through all of them. I will say that it is hard to separate this issue from the fact that this is basically a period piece, but the female characters and their actors are all notably kind of underwritten. It's not that they lack depth, it's that their cultural and social context, I think, is the main problem and the main barrier for them to have more depth of character or more screen time, or better writing. So it's kind of hard to mix those up. I think all of the actresses who are in the film do a perfectly good job as well, similar to the rest of sort of the ensemble cast. So no real substantial issues with any of the casting. Some little bits and pieces here and there, I would say, with the script itself and some of how it's written, but those issues are fairly minor. I think that the location stuff is really very good. The use of the sets and the costuming is very, very good. I cannot speak that well to the historical accuracy or the level of anachronism that is present. There are definitely small things that I notice that I think are anachronistic, but nothing that tore me out of it too much. And I think a lot of the costuming and the location stuff is done very well in a way that is both satisfying narratively and satisfying visually, because in a movie that has very good cinematic presentation, very good cinematography and use of color and use of sets and blocking and all these sorts of things, having even just the color of somebody's clothes or the color of an inanimate object, or the sort of the shape of a chair even makes a huge difference. And there are a lot of props to, no pun intended, a lot of props to the prop team and to everybody who did all the set dressings, all the location stuff, all of the costuming. I think that's all done very, very well. There's also quite a bit of makeup work, I think, or practical effects work, minor practical effects work that I think is executed very well. If I did have to to point one thing out, I think this movie does make some use of both green screening and CG that is not up to snuff, basically. It's just not good. It's not horrible, and it's not so bad I want it removed entirely, but I would have preferred if they had polished it a bit more or omitted it in a lot of those cases. So when it's a little bothersome when you have a really, really well shot scene and they could have just taken an effect out of it, made it seem a little bit less, it would be a little less flashy, but it would be less distracting for me as well. But that's a personal preference, I think. The audio editing is also really notably good to me. There's some really nice audio work. A lot of the music, I believe, is licensed or it's historical. So there's less to say about the soundtrack, but the audio editing itself, the use of sound, the use of sound editing, sound cuts in and out, and those sorts of things, again, lend themselves to this narrative and the senses of being in a psychiatric facility and going through psychological things yourself. And I was worried at first because of some of the earliest sound edits started to sound a little bit more like the kind of cheesy sound editing that's used for typical horror movies, but it takes a turn fairly quickly away from the typical sort of like ramping up in sound and like creeping kind of creeping editing that makes that it's trying to build tension in a scene with very little other than audio. It kind of abandons that pretty quickly, which I'm happy for, because I think there are some scenes that use strategic sound editing very well and don't use it for jump scares and crap like that. So credit where it's due there. Overall, though, I think the pacing is very good, I think. The story has some issues here and there, but they're fairly minor. And as I mentioned, the script has some issues here and there. Again, this is something I would probably want to take another crack at the film to understand it better a second or third time around before I made a stronger commitment to those feelings. But at the same time, there are some things that I am critical of because they are not obvious enough, or that I might be wrong about them, but because they are too obvious. This is ultimately a movie with a great element of mystery, but it is sometimes a little bit too generous with the audience. This is a very Hollywood movie. I get why they do some of it, but some of the hints, some of the mystery could have been a little bit more subdued. There were a few too many things where I went, well, that seems obviously weird, in a very specific way. Not even in a, that's suspicious, should keep an eye on it. That's I'm pretty sure I know exactly what that's going to mean in 20 to 40 minutes. And then finding out that I'm right. There's also one scene towards the end where they do sort of a reveal, and you're like, oh, okay, good reveal. And then they hammer it home by basically just saying exactly what it is. And all I could think for that is just like, okay, if you didn't already get it, then explaining it explicitly is sort of ruining it. So don't do that. So again, I think that's being overly generous with a Hollywood audience expectation, but it's not so distracting as to seriously rip me out of it. I would just generally like to have seen a little bit more subtlety in the movie throughout, because I think it's a really interesting narrative. It's a really interesting character, a really interesting sort of setting, and there's so much character to explore that feeling the need to hammer things home as much as they are feels a little ham-fisted. And that mostly shows up in the form of the dialogue writing. There's a little bit of it in the pacing, but generally I think the pacing is quite good, and keeps the pace up, keeps the tension up without feeling like it's either breakneck or lingering too long because it's, being self-indulgent. So it avoids those pitfalls. Let's see about the rest of this. That's most of the stuff about the production itself. So I think this is very, very solid. I don't think it's Scorsese's best movie. I don't think it's the best horror movie or the best thriller or anything like that. But it's very solid, and everything about it is executed well enough that it comes together into much greater than the sum of its parts that I have a lot of appreciation for this film. It's very Hollywood, and you know what? That's okay. It's doing exactly what I sort of expect. Except for some of the narrative beats, which I find kind of interesting and a little bit more subtle. So I'm not going to talk about specific events too much in the next segment, but if you don't want any spoiler at all, and you haven't seen it, then maybe cut off here. So the thing that's pretty evident throughout most of the film, as I already mentioned, is that DiCaprio's character is a very unreliable narrator with stuff going on in his own head. And I think there is some interesting stuff that goes on in the narrative about why he is the way he is, or why he appears to be the way he is, because we aren't getting an internal monologue or anything. We're not getting an explicit narrative behind the narrative to understand his sort of psychological subtext. So a lot of it, some of the things that are a little bit ham-fisted are unfortunately because his presentation is sort of standoffish. The character who he is not talking about his own psychological state. He is, by definition, sort of in denial about his own issues, his own stuff going on. So very early on, we're introduced to the fact that he has a personal sort of feeling behind this place, a personal reason for being here. He's got, the first scene is him having a terrible time on the boat, because he's, and it's like, okay. So from the very start, we get the understanding that this is a guy who is he's out of his comfort zone. He's out of his element. He doesn't like a lot of the things that are going on. He has personal problems with some of the others, and then he's sort of he sort of got his own agenda in addition to his alleged agenda that he's doing for his actual work. He's also notably easy to agitate. He's presented as somebody who's very good at the job he's actually doing, or at least reasonably competent, because he's continuing to have pretty good success as he goes on. But that he's easy to bother, to the point that there are people regularly who seem to be, or explicitly are, deliberately bothering him. And so that gets into some of sort of the other stuff that the narrative tells us is, as it goes along, is haunting him, whether it's his personal past with his family, his past with the war, all these other things that have happened in his life that have gotten him into this psychologically agitated state before he was ever close to this situation. And so that makes him a very compelling character from a sort of external standpoint, where he himself as as the character on screen as acted is maybe not as compelling, but there is a sort of empathetic feeling towards a lot of his struggle, because you can see him suffering in his own body, in his own mind, but trying to hide it or trying to deny it, and trying to look at this from a sort of context of the 1950s and of a guy who came out of the army and all these other things. I think it's easy to look at him and feel a lot of pity. I think that was the prevailing emotion for me throughout this film for him, was one of, this is a guy who's suffering, and through untreated PTSD and just being toxic masculinity and all the things that come with having been in the army and being having had a bunch of family events that were really negative and all these other things. Like, that is somebody who both has a lot of bad going on that he expresses poorly. He expresses himself and his own emotions, and he copes with his own problems really poorly. But he also that doesn't mean he's like inherently a bad person. That's just, a lot of that is like patterns of that are seen very commonly in men who would have had the same experiences. They weren't exactly treating veterans well. They weren't exactly treating, the idea of men's mental health, or really mental health at all, was not really a thing at any point, any time near this period. And so to watch him go all the way through the end, where he has more moments of understanding and realization and acceptance of his situation, those are moments of genuine emotional interest and character interest. And it genuinely got me, kind of weepy at certain points, of just like watching this man suffer, often mostly by his own hand or by neglect of himself and society in general. And so there is sort of a unique narrative here that it would even acknowledge sort of those psychological issues, even let alone in a guy in this period, and makes the sort of the final concluding chapter all the more impactful and all the more worth reflecting on, I think. This is the part where I'm not going to say anything more. I'd like to say more about that, but I think that would be hard spoilers, and at that point I'm just, that'd be something I'd be more likely to discuss with somebody else. But I think if you've seen the movie at this point, you'll get it, and if you haven't, then maybe go do. I think it's very solid in no small part because of that. He is an interesting character because of what's written around him and what's written about what the subtext is in a historical context and behind the psychology of the individual, the things that we are told and how they lead to the things that we are not told. Anyway, I won't ramble too much longer. I think that's about it. This movie is quite good. I'm quite happy to have finally seen it, and I owe an old friend a message or something to talk about it maybe. So anyway, thank you guys for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched, and I'll see you guys next time.